So for my presentation, my final paper really, I worked on Silko's ceremony, the full text, not just the excerpt that we had in our postmodern American fiction. And because papers need a title, this one got Deconstructing Knowledge in Silko's Ceremony, Overcoming the Impact of Communal Trauma and Western Assimilation Through Native American Narrative. So for my thesis, this essay focuses on postmodern theory as a transformative construct in ceremony, elevating the protagonist Teo beyond a simple caricature and into a more representational character, acting as a larger cultural expression. Postmodern theory is combined with some 21st century scholarship and highlights the influence of integration versus assimilation, considers free play, and speaks to ontological truth as pivotal to subverting colonization and constructing new narratives within a post-colonial environment. So no postmodern work of literature would be complete without a little decentering. And as a work of postmodern lit, Silko does seek to destabilize logocentric Western knowledge, decentralize grand narratives, reject binary constructs, and she uses language focused on dialectical synthesis to deliver agency to some bounded and marginalized post-colonial cultures. While discussing post-coloniality, we're going to foreground trauma against a backdrop of violence and oppression. This paper avoids medically defining trauma or engaging medical theory such as the DSM-4 and really allows Silko's narrative expression, imagery, compassion, and often indifference to illuminate the individual and cultural impacts. A good example of the way Silko uses narrative expression to define trauma. Teo, our lead protagonist, could feel it inside his skull, the tension of little threads being pulled and how it was with tangled things tied together. As he tried to pull them apart and rewind them into their places, they snagged and tangled even more. It's good foreshadowing for Silko, who is going to have to untangle the emotional and mental skein of individual and cultural trauma in the postbellum era for Native American culture. Her language is intended to build up this monolith of Western science and culture as our lead antagonist. Not so much evil, but definitely a corrupting influence on native narrative, and she erects these binaries really just to devour them as the novel progresses. So Silko conspicuously incorporates whiteness into her story to provide the aesthetic of sanitization, the whitewashing of consciousness and memory, a formal allusion to the ideas also of Western racial superiority, which is enclosing or entombing a trauma subject. Here we see Teo in his Los Angeles veterans home, and Teo remarks that for a long time he had been white smoke. He did not realize that until he left the hospital because white smoke had no consciousness. It faded into the white world of their beds and the bed sheets and walls. It was sucked away by the words of doctors who tried to talk to the invisible scattered smoke. He had seen outlines of gray tables, outlines of food, which was only an outline as well. All the outlines he saw. They saw his outline, but they didn't realize it was hollow inside. Part of this hollowness, this marginalizing of this outlining, reveals a distinct Western position of othering as part of a repressive structure fostering the ultimate antagonistic figure of Westernization. In his section on memory in post-colonial literature, Justin Edwards claims narratives of trauma often move from the memories of individuals impacted directly by a traumatic experience into communal narratives based on strategies of cultural coping. Silko's expansive textual rendering of trauma works to build the metaphorical language and the rhythm and pacing. Her prose, poetic composition, and myth construction memorializes echoes of drumbeats and tribal chants within the narrative. As the story progresses and Teo's condition devolves, his character develops, and his story narrows like a framed square of yellow sunshine, similar to the way the east and west boundaries of Native American land narrowed. Really starts to highlight the language strategies employed by Silko to erase distance between center and margins and to begin to construct these binaries that would reopen American landscape to free play in the end. Silko parades the postmodern concepts of centering and binaries not only through the characters and the dialogue, but the textual play on setting. Her central contest is between the march of Western modernity's hegemonic influence and native narrative. Interestingly, the West in this story is both center of cultural simulation on the reservation, type of origin, and also acts as a barrier at the surrounding margins of the reservation when considered geographically. The juxtaposition of the colonized Native American, segregated on warren land, bounded and marginalized by Western modernity, is the trauma that must be cured or deconstructed and forms the basis for the novel's ceremony. and the beginning of healing for Teo and the tribal society with an amalgamated dialectical path forward. Free play is critical to releasing the trauma experienced by Teo on a personal and emotional level, as well as the cultural trauma experienced by the Native American population within Laguna Puebla, and establishing a pathway to a new dialectical truth beyond the confluence of these ideas. Adrian Akins notes, Bettany plays a central role in helping Teo work through the import of his memories without rejecting or forgetting them, as he was prompted to do by the white doctors in medicine in the Los Angeles Veterans Hospital. So by encouraging and supporting free play through accommodation rather than rejection, Silko and Bettany create space for both Western and Native American culture and ideals to be expressed, positioning a new truth to survive in a dialectical form. At Silko's climax, the decentralization moment, registers for the reader as a point of deconstruction as Teo acts out of caricature by not responding to his friend's torture through violence, tearing down not only Teo's own narrative, but the Western stereotypes. Teo remarks, the witchery had almost ended the story according to its plan. Teo had almost jammed the screwdriver into Emo's skull the way the witchery had wanted. Their deadly ritual for autumn solstice would have been completed by him. He would have been another victim, a drunk Indian war veteran. The white people would shake their heads. Ultimately, Silko's challenge in contrasting the empirical Western knowledge with native knowledge narrative was to subvert what Leotard classifies as a lament in the postmodern condition. Postmodernity boils down to mourning the fact that knowledge is no longer principally narrative. Leotard's philosophical musings parallel Silko's narrative, stating technocrats declare that they can't trust what society designates as it needs. They know that society cannot know its own needs. The postmodern world Silko creates attempts to decenter the Western origin stories, deconstruct the interminable advancement of Western empirical science as a key knowledge creator, allowing narrative to survive within the discourse.